I want to know what's the most surprising health benefit of spices that you've discovered from looking at all the research, and that's like really surprised you that many people might not realize.
Yeah, so I think the biggest kind of skepticism arises because, when you add spices to food, you really add very small amounts. If anyone's cooked with spices, they might think, well, how can it really make a difference? Like, say I'm whipping up a lentil soup and I put a little sprinkling of cumin and a little sprinkling of chili powder and turmeric. Yes, I know that's vibrant and lovely, and it might add some complexity in terms of flavor, but how can such tiny amounts of something actually amount to something with real benefit for health? And for a long time, we had to pull from disparate studies like animal studies and test tube studies before we could really make a claim. But now we have some real human studies, which are super exciting. So in 2020, there was a study that came out of Penn State that looked at the addition of culinary amounts of a spice blend. So not sort of therapeutic amounts, not a supplement, but just culinary amounts that you and I would put in our food at home. And it looked at markers of inflammation right after ingestion of a meal with that culinary blend. And it was a blend of many spices like ginger, turmeric, cumin, cinnamon, thyme, oregano. It was quite a complex blend. But what they found is just the addition of about 1.5 teaspoons of a spice blend in a meal resulted in meaningful reductions in markers of inflammation. And as you and I know, and as many people listening know, chronic low-grade inflammation is really one of the scourges of our modern kind of health crisis today. We have too much chronic inflammation because of various factors, from stress and toxins in our environment to the food we eat. So anything we can do to keep that chronic inflammation in check is of interest when it comes to disease prevention and also feeling amazing now. And what we now know is that the regular addition of culinary amounts of spices in our food can really keep that chronic inflammation in check, which I think is so powerful and so actionable.
I love that you mentioned that study from Penn State, because also what you didn't mention, which I think is really important, it was an American standard diet that they were using. So it wasn't that they were having all of these like beautiful, rich foods, like wholesome foods all the time and adding this in, which automatically people might think if they're having these delicious spices, they're cooking, as you said, like a lentil soup. And that's what's really kind of profound about that study, is that actually, if we think about the Western diet, which is the American diet, and we're just adding in these spices, it's actually having a really profound effect. So that makes me kind of start at the beginning, really, which I love that you mentioned. What is the difference between spices and herbs? Because I think before we go in, because you just mentioned there a list of probably about 8 different spices, but what is the difference when we're thinking about spices and herbs? And do they have the same properties and compounds or not?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, it's really a semantic difference, to be honest. Spices are officially considered anything from a plant that is the dried root, stem, seed, flower bud or flower, or even the bark. So like a cinnamon bark, for example, that would be a spice. The leaf, when dried, is an herb, or fresh is an herb. So it's really the leaf versus everything else of the plant. The leaf is the herb, everything else is the spice. From a benefit perspective and beneficial polyphenols and phytochemicals, there's a lot of overlap. So I think it's really more of like a semantic distinction. And maybe the culinary purists would say, well, herbs are different and spices are different. And they are in the way that we cook with them. So, people will often add spices at the beginning of a dish in oil, whereas the herbs kind of go a little bit later on, or you might finish with an herb. But really, in terms of benefits, there's a lot of overlap, and they do come from the magical plant kingdom, which we all love and we know is one of the most kind of healing sources, gifts from nature that we can leverage in our lives.
So people might now think, oh gosh, what's in my spice cupboard? Like how much of these do I have? So where should we start? Like how can people start implementing this when they're going to the shops? Do you have a few that you would recommend to start as a base, and how can we think about cooking with them? And also, to add into that question, is there a way to maximize these spices when cooking with them as well?
Yeah, fantastic question. So before I tackle that question, I will add one spice that we didn't touch upon, but I think it's quite important because there's quite a bit of research around it, which is cinnamon. And I also think people find cinnamon to be quite accessible and it's familiar. We think of like the holidays and the cookies and the treats, but I'm going to challenge people to try to use cinnamon on a daily basis. And that's because we have quite a robust body of literature that shows that cinnamon can really help our metabolic health. As we know, unfortunately, because of a confluence of factors in our modern day and our modern food environment, many, many people are struggling with metabolic ill health, elevated blood glucose, poor blood sugar control, insulin resistance. And a recent study out of UCLA basically showed that, again, culinary amounts of cinnamon every single day, so like a couple teaspoons, actually lowered average blood glucose concentrations, which is really, really powerful. So if you are following a dietary pattern that is supportive of metabolic health, adding cinnamon to that is only going to help. And it's really easy.
Is that before your Eat Food, with the one that came out of the UCLA with the blood glucose? How was that? How did they measure that? When was the cinnamon taken, or was it just included in the daily meals?
Yeah, it was included in the daily regimen, and it was actually a double blind. So they gave people capsules, so they didn't know whether they were having cinnamon or a placebo. And then they did a crossover, which is really the ultimate gold standard. So people then switched over to placebo versus cinnamon, and they found statistically significant reductions in average blood glucose concentrations in a 24-hour period in the group that had exposure in a day to about a teaspoon or 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. And I've had people say to me, wow, that's a lot of cinnamon. Like, who's having 1 to 2 teaspoons of cinnamon? Let me tell you, if you add half a teaspoon of cinnamon to your morning latte, which is delicious, a teaspoon to your smoothie, sprinkle it on your oatmeal, say you make some delicious banana bread for your family, you add cinnamon to that. It's actually not that hard to get to like 1 to 2 teaspoons a day.
Do you remember?
Yeah.
I'm just sorry. Do you remember the cinnamon challenge?
The cinnamon. Oh, is that from YouTube?
Yeah. I think it was a couple of years ago when there was like, people had to put in a whole teaspoon of cinnamon, and it basically had such an adverse reaction. It's just reminding me of people now listening to this and all of a sudden scooping like teaspoons of cinnamon in their mouth, thinking that it's going to have all these health benefits.
Oh my gosh, Sarah. So, my kids, I have an almost tween son who is obsessed with one of these viral videos on YouTube with the cinnamon challenge. And I literally watched my kids watching it, and I was like, don't do that. That is not how you enjoy cinnamon. You're going to end up in the ER. You can asphyxiate on like having too much cinnamon by your nose. So no, add it to your food. Do not ingest an entire spoon of dry cinnamon or any dry spice. That's not how they were intended to be used.
But if you do, please tag us on Instagram and YouTube so we can watch it.
Oh my gosh. You heard it here. Don't do that, people. Anyway.
Yeah, don't do it.
So,
be safe.
So we mentioned cinnamon, but to your point about how should people get started, I always say, start where you're at. So take the foods that you already love and enjoy and begin adding spices to them. That's just a great way to add something new, add more plant diversity, add more polyphenols. So say you have, oats for breakfast, add some cinnamon, add a little dusting of nutmeg, add a little bit of clove. Say you like, a cup of tea, or you want to try like a spiced chai, which is the Indian tea with spices, add a little bit of cardamom and cinnamon to that. Just simmer your water with a little bit of cardamom and cinnamon, put your black tea leaves, your milk, you're done. So don't have to start from scratch. Don't have to reinvent the wheel. Don't have to completely start cooking new things. Take the things you already make and add spices to them. And I always tell people, start with 3 to 5 spices. You don't have to start with an entire spice drawer that's going to feel overwhelming. So my 3 to 5 kind of go-to spices for a spice beginner would be turmeric. It's really easy to use in a wide variety of dishes. It's very kind of gentle on the palate, has a bit of an earthy vibe, softens when you bloom it in oil or, butter or whatever your fat of choice. So turmeric is great. Pair it with black pepper. You've already got 2 spices there. Cinnamon. And I will mention a little finer point about cinnamon. So if you are using cinnamon often because you want better metabolic health or you're trying to control your blood sugar, go out of your way and find a variety that's called true cinnamon. That's because the regular cinnamon, which is cassia cinnamon, at high enough doses may cause some liver issues because it has a compound called coumarin, which at, again, high enough concentrations could be a liver toxin. If you go out of your way to find, if you go out of your way to find true cinnamon, something called Ceylon cinnamon, it has negligible amounts of coumarin. So it's a really nice way to get the cinnamon benefits without some of the potentially negative side effects.